think we'll get started here. Thanks everybody out there in Zoom world for coming on over for a Avi Awareness Night. Uh-oh. Everybody have a fun day out there today. Find some soft snow. Perfect. So why is Avi safety important? Well, because avalanches are dangerous. And so the more prepared we can be going into, out of the bounds and into the backcountry, the better. Quite a few people do die annually in avalanche accidents. There's been quite a few this year already, and last year was one of the deadliest years in recent memory. So probably for a lot of us here, this will be some review, but when in doubt, always go back to the basics when it comes to avalanche safety. So what are the things we need to have an avalanche? And this is the avalanche triangle. There really are these three things need to be find a happy place together to create an avalanche. We need avalanche terrain, we need unstable snow, and then we need some sort of trigger to create the avalanche. So avalanche terrain, we talk a lot about terrain, and the biggest thing we talk about is the slope angle of the terrain. And this is just the prime time angle at which the avalanche wants to run. So that range is usually from 30 to 45 degrees or so. It kind of varies a little bit depending on the type of avalanche we're talking about and the type of snow we're dealing with. But generally speaking, under 30 degrees or so, gravity just isn't intense enough to kind of overdo the slope there. And then over 45, it's kind of too steep. And what we actually see quite a bit of avalanche activity in those steeper ranges. They just happen more often. So it sort of self-mitigates. It keeps it from becoming a more large and dangerous avalanche. But when we were talking about steeper slopes and avalanche terrain, we want to also keep in mind how steep the terrain is above us. We can actually be standing in more flat ground on those lower slope angles, but if we're underneath the big piece of terrain, like this avalanche path here on the side of McGee Mountain, we can actually still be within that avalanche terrain. And then of course, we also want to think of terrain traps. And these are really any piece of the terrain that increases the hazard or increases the consequence of an avalanche occurring. So we often talk about gully features. Road cuts are a really good example of a terrain trap. And then also cliff bands or even stands of trees and rock outcroppings, things like that. Pieces of bare earth can also be a terrain trap. And really it's just anything that, like I said, increases the consequence of an avalanche occurring in that location. So when we think of unstable snow, it's important that we start to kind of build a season history in our brains. And really this starts from that first snowfall. We see these come in different storm events, and then we'll have dry periods. Maybe we see wind or other types of erosion on that snowpack. And that all changes the surface, which then changes the interaction between the different layers when we see new snow. Like I said, it's important that we map that out over the season so that we have an idea of where those weak layers and where we might see those avalanches occurring. Where are the good bed surfaces and the weak layers, and do we have a slab? So we talk about 9 different types of avalanches here in North America, and all of these different avalanches have kind of significant, they all affect how we want to move through the terrain and how we're thinking about our choices when traveling in the backcountry, because they all act differently. They all have different characteristics. They orient themselves in different places in the terrain, et cetera, and they happen at different times. In general, we have kind of 2 types of avalanches. We have loose avalanches and slab avalanches. This picture on the top is an example of the slab avalanche. These are generally more dangerous, more deadly occurrences. And then the loose avalanches, like the bottom picture there, tend to be smaller in general. They can get quite large, but generally they're a little less concerning. So loose avalanches, there are two types of loose avalanche. We have the wet loose avalanche, and then a dry loose avalanche. The picture on the left there is a wet loose avalanche that occurred in the Sherwins a couple of years ago. And then on the right there is a dry loose avalanche. And really the difference there is kind of in the name. A wet loose avalanche is when we see a lot of solar gain, or maybe we have a rain on snow event that stiffens up the surface snow, creates it, and is wet. It's often sticky. We'll be kind of see the roller balls and pinwheels. That's usually a good sign of before we'll see the loose wet avalanche. And then a loose dry is really when the loose surface snow is just kind of sloughing off. And you might recognize those from big ski movies, things like that in Alaska. Those are those sloughs that they're often talking about, the slough terrain. Those are dry loose avalanches. And this is often what kind of mitigates that steeper terrain, is we'll have these loose dry sloughs that just kind of take the snow away before it has a chance to build up that slab. And then of course we get into the slab avalanche, and the slab is more dangerous because it breaks off kind of like a dinner plate. So this whole section here broke off at one time. So from wherever the trigger was that created this avalanche, it actually propagated across the slope, and this whole chunk of snow slid off at one point, at one time. So this is why it can be a lot more dangerous, because we can maybe be standing in the middle of this slab, or maybe at the bottom of it, when we trigger it. So it can often have a lot more snow above us, traveling with us, etc. But there are some pretty distinct parts to the avalanche. We've got the crown, which is the top of the slab avalanche. We have the flanks, which are on either side. And then this is called the stalk wall. This is the bottom of the slab. And then, of course, this is the bed surface that the slab runs on. And then we have what we call the track, which is this area below the stalk wall, but above what we call the debris fan. And then, of course, this is down here. This is the toe of the avalanche. And oftentimes, we'll see these, when an avalanche runs, it initiates on that steeper slope angle, and it'll often run through the remainder of the steep angle, and then it'll settle down here in the lower angle area. So once it starts to bench out, is where we typically will find that debris fan. So here in the Sierra, we can see all 9 types of avalanches here, but these are definitely our most common. You guys who live here, we have a lot of wind. We often get more wind than snow. So wind slab is a primary concern here. We also, when we do see snow, we tend to have kind of warmer snow storms and really big precip events. Maybe not yesterday, but I'd say that's not uncommon for us to have a really large event. So we do see quite a bit of storm slab activity. And we also see a lot of persistent slabs. I would say that it's typically not as concerning for us as it might be in a more continental snowpack like Colorado or Utah, Wyoming, areas like that. But we do certainly see those. And then of course we get a lot of intense solar radiation here. The loose, wet, and even wet slab avalanches tend to be pretty common for us. So we'll talk a little bit about each of those. So a storm slab, typically these occur during a storm event or immediately following the storm event. They can heal pretty quickly in a matter of hours or days. They can stabilize. A storm slab usually occurs within the new storm snow. And I would say the most common time to see them here is when we have a storm that comes in cold and then turns warm towards the end of the storm event. So we get that really upside down, pretty distinctive upside down snowpack. That's when we tend to see those storm slabs. This is a good example of some storm instability. And you can kind of see it cracking away from the skier here and sloughing down the hill there. Storm slabs tend to be, not always, but they tend to be a little looser in feel. They're not quite as stiff as maybe a wind slab or a more persistent slab avalanche. And so we'll often see these shooting cracks, and then there's a clear crown line here. And sometimes they do kind of break away in these chunks and then get bigger and bigger as they go. The line between a loose dry and a storm slab is sometimes hard to define. They happen usually around the same time as each other. So sometimes you'll hear us at the Avi Center talk about them as storm instabilities, and it's trying to encompass both of those things at once. So If you're seeing one, you're probably going to see the other as well. Wind slabs. So wind slabs tend to be more specific in distribution. Storm slabs will be kind of everywhere that snow falls and stays on the ground. And wind slabs are generally going to be occurring on one aspect or another, depending on which way the wind is blowing. So kind of like this house here at the bottom, the wind has clearly been blowing from the right side of the screen to the left. And you can tell by where the snow is depositing. So it's ripping the snow off of this side of the roof and depositing it on this side. And you can see there's quite a bit more, it's quite dramatic, the difference in depth there. And that can occur really quickly. The wind can actually move far more snow more quickly than it can fall from the sky. And so we can actually have increasing hazard even on a blue sky day due to the wind. And we're often looking for features like these cornice features are a good sign that there might be a wind slab down below. This cornice is essentially the same thing that's happening on the roof here, depositing here, but it's also a sign that it's depositing on the slope below that cornice. And then of course we also see these cross-loading wind slabs. So if the wind is blowing across the slope, like it is depicted here, we might see the snow stripped from this side of a little ridge feature and deposited in this gully feature over here. So we want to be careful of that as well. And sometimes when we have really strong winds, like we see here quite often, we'll actually see this type of area get stripped all the way back down to bare ground. And this tends to be the only slidable surface on that slope. But it's also a good sign that that is also probably somewhere that was loaded by the wind. Wind slabs, they don't last forever either. They can be days or sometimes weeks. It just depends on a variety of factors, temperature, et cetera, and also what the bed surface below that wind slab might be. Here's a little video. This is from Mammoth Mountain, blue sky day, but I think that's the dragon's tail completely covered by the plumes of snow ripping off the backside there. So this is a good example of some of the major winds we can see here on the east side. Wind slab, when looking for signs of wind slab, we often see kind of these sculpted surfaces, so uneven surfaces. We'll see what we call sastrugi, which are these big wind whales and just kind of really cool fins in the snow. Or we might feel the snow feels kind of hollow and stiff up top, and maybe less stiff underneath. And we often see these kind of really clearly defined cracks when we can find these test slopes, or if you trigger a wind slab, it's often going to be it's a harder slab than those storm slabs. So they tend to be really clean lines, and yeah, they can be quite big and dangerous. This is another quick test we often use to find those wind slabs and just see how big they are, how reactive they are. This is a little hand pit. You can see that's about a foot or so thick there. Often it's a lot less stiff underneath the initial slab. Persistent slab avalanches. So we need a persistent weak layer to have a persistent slab avalanche. This is a good, really visual example from last season before we got our major storm event in the end of January. But these are what we call basal facets, even approaching a depth where here, right on the ground. And you can just see the difference between how gray and kind of large grained these are. And then this is the December snow that was much newer. And this is our slab up on top of our weak layer. And we call them persistent slabs because they will persist for a long time. So we can often see continued propagation on these weak layers for up to months or even the whole season, depending on where we are and what the layer is. And often, I think it is one thing to talk about with persistent slab avalanches and persistent weak layers is we can have a persistent weak layer in the snowpack without having a persistent slab problem. Like the snowpack will kind of adapt and find a happy place where it's not a reactive issue anymore. But that weak layer might still be there. And if we add a significant load to that snowpack, we might throw it out of whack and see it start to produce avalanches again. So when we do have a persistent slab issue, similar to what we had in December, it is important to keep that in mind for the whole season, because it might not actually disappear off our radar forever. It might come back. And if you go somewhere like Colorado into that continental snowpack, you'll often see a persistent slab problem up all season. So it's certainly not, it's an important one to keep in mind, especially as we see these thinner snowpacks. The way these often, especially these basal facet layers are built is when we have an early season storm, maybe in October, September, sometime like that, and it stays cold and dry. And we have a really thin snowpack for a long period of time. We'll see that snowpack weaken over time and facet out a bit. And then once we start seeing snow again, it buries those weak layers. So a shallow, cold snowpack will often weaken over time. And that's sort of what we saw from our initial storms this season. And we're seeing it even right now over the last 7 weeks of our dry spell. It stayed pretty cold, and we've seen the whole snowpack kind of start to facet out a bit. So this will be a good one to keep in mind if and when hopefully we see a significant storm in the future. Another persistent weak layer that we don't often see here, but we do at times, is surface hoar. There's actually some really impressive surface hoar out in the backcountry right now. And they're really beautiful snow grains. It's actually frozen dew. So it's not snow that fell from the sky. It's growing on the surface of the snow, but they create these really beautiful feathers. And they're really strong in compression, really weak in shear. Picture like a bed of nails, right? Like you can lie on a bed of nails because the weight is distributed over all the different nails. But if you step on one, not so good, it'll break pretty easily. Or poke through your foot, I guess. But that's kind of the idea with the surface. So these avalanches can break really fast and far, and they're really easy to remotely trigger. And that's another thing with the persistent slab avalanches to keep in mind, is that we can often see these trigger from a long distance away. We can trigger them from lower angle slopes below slide paths. They're not contained by terrain features that you might typically expect, like a wind slab will be kind of confined to that leeward slope. But a persistent slab avalanche can break beyond those kind of terrain boundaries. This is a good example of some basal facets, some depth hoar here. You can just see we have that really strong slab on top of this weak, sugary snow. And if you're ever trying to kind of decide the difference between a facet and a round, rounds make really good snowballs, and facets don't make snowballs at all. They kind of crumble apart. They're larger grains. They tend to be kind of crunchy. That's a good way to good thing to keep in mind there. This is a good example of a persistent slab issue here. We had a weak layer in the snowpack. This is extended column test, something we use and talk about a lot in the avalanche forecast. We can see that it broke pretty easily and propagated across that whole column. Nice weak layer underneath, a stiffer slab above. This is a good example of a persistent slab avalanche back in 2015. This is the climax avalanche up on Mammoth Mountain. We had another one pretty sizable this year. I've got a photo later on. Yeah, we have those basal facets and they're buried under quite a bit. And often when we see a persistent slab issue come back to life or come to life in the first place, it's after a really big storm cycle. So when we have those really big dumps, that's the time to kind of put your brain back on for the persistent issue. Loose wet avalanches, kind of talked about these earlier, but these typically start at a point, whether it be something that I start on my skis, or maybe it's a chunk of ice or a rock falling off a cliff that's warming up in the sun. And then they create a fan that gets bigger and bigger and bigger as it goes down the hill. And so sometimes we think of loose avalanches as a little easier to manage because they tend to occur below me if I'm the one triggering it. But I also want to caution us on that because, oftentimes it's when these can occur above us as well. If we find ourselves out, maybe traveling underneath a steeper slope that's in the sun. These tend to occur a lot in the spring when we have that kind of longer day and more intense solar radiation. Or days like today would be another good example. When we have a storm event and then we get that first day of sun, that's when I really kind of tend to worry about them more than if it's been cycling day after day after day of hot sun and then refreezing at night. But yes, we always want to be careful of what's above us as well. So if we find ourselves out there with a steep solar aspect above us, and maybe if we were crossing underneath this area and it was getting warmer than we expected, that might be a good reason to find a different place to travel. And then a wet slab avalanche, these tend to be quite destructive. They can be quite large. They are also wet, like the loose wet, which, so they tend to move. Avalanches often move kind of like water in general, but these wet avalanches especially can be quite fluid and destructive. But a wet slab avalanche, this often occurs when we have water percolating through the snow. They can happen on the ground. The ground can be the bed surface, or maybe on top of a crust layer, or in one of those kind of persistent weak layers. But usually these occur during a really big warm-up event, or maybe some rain on snow, but when we introduce the water to the snowpack. These, when, wet slab, I came from the Northwest before I moved here, and we would have some pretty large wet avalanches that can actually gouge the landscape and be really quite destructive. So these can be really hard to predict, but they do happen. I believe, was it 2017, 18 when Fresno Bowl had a pretty good example of a good wet avalanche that created a new groove into the slope. So definitely want to keep that in mind when we see those really big warm-up events, especially if we have kind of a weak structure in the snowpack. And so what does this mean for us, right? I guess the thing I want to kind of hammer home here is that we can always pick terrain that sets us up to avoid different problems, right? So if we are worried about wind slab, we want to start thinking, where's that wind coming from? Where's the snow blowing to? Did the wind shift? Maybe it's blowing from the north today, but yesterday it was from the south. And does that mean that we might see wind slabs on all aspects? So we want to keep that in mind as we're picking which terrain to travel on. Are we worried about loose wet avalanches? Which aspects are going to see the sun? In the spring, we often talk about east aspects becoming unstable first, moving to the south and then to the west, and that's following the sun throughout the day. And then if it's precipitating, if we're seeing rain, if we're seeing snow, those instabilities might be more widespread around the compass rose. So triggers, the third part of our triangle. We can have natural triggers, and this may be a recent load of new snow or rain, maybe wind loading, rapid warming. They can be other events like rock falls or cornice failures. But the ones we're really worried about most of the time are our human triggered avalanches. We, as humans, are great triggers. Whether we're skiing, snowboarding, snow machining, walking, we have an impact on that snowpack. Typically on skis, I like to think of it as a sort of a half circle, a half sphere below me into the snow. And I'm impacting roughly about 3 to 4 feet below me. So as I'm just walking on my skis, obviously if I'm on a snow machine, I'm probably going to impact deeper into the snowpack, etc. But this is important because if I wasn't there to trigger an avalanche, or if my partner wasn't there to trigger an avalanche on me, then I'm not really that worried about it, right? So 90% of avalanche accidents, the victim or someone in the party was the trigger of the avalanche. Which is why we want to kind of keep in mind our terrain choices, because we are always going to be a trigger, whether we like it or not. We can't remove that part, right? We can't change the state of the snowpack. What we can change is our terrain choice. So that's really our kind of best weapon in avoiding being caught in an avalanche. So let's talk about the red flags. These are 5 things that we should all keep in mind and be on the lookout for all the time in the backcountry. Recent new snow. Did we see a significant load in the last 48 hours? Or is it snowing really hard right now? My kind of rule of thumb is 1 inch an hour, and it starts to be a red flag. Have we seen recent avalanche activity? If we see an avalanche occur, it's a good sign that we could probably trigger one. Are we seeing the wind blowing snow around? Collapsing and cracking, these are signs of instability. So if we're seeing shooting cracks, maybe from my skis or, you know, from anything else that we might see, but usually it's going to be from me walking or my friend walking. Collapsing in the snowpack, or usually that's accompanied by the sound we describe as woomphing, which sounds just like that. It's a woomph. They can be quiet, they can be really quite loud, but a collapse in the snowpack is really, it is what happens when we trigger a weak layer. We initiate the failure in the snowpack, but we might not be creating an avalanche. But if we were on steeper terrain, if we were in avalanche terrain, that collapse would likely create an avalanche. So we're essentially creating one in flatter terrain. And they, like I said, they can be quite large. I've had collapses in the snowpack that feel like the ground was just taken out from under me, and like drop. And that's quite disconcerting. Seen it shake trees and snow falls off the trees. And whoops have been like really loud. That can be really spooky. And then of course, rapid warming. You know, today was a good example, right? Yesterday it was highs were in the mid-teens, and today they were approaching 40 degrees in the mid elevations, right? So that's a pretty rapid warming event. This is a good example of a recent new snow that we might want to be concerned with. I feel like we get these a lot of the time here in the Mammoth area. We'll see, you know, pretty mind-boggling snow totals in a short amount of time, and that's a huge red flag. Again, recent avalanche activity. If I trigger one, or if I see one that looks pretty fresh, it's a good sign that I might be able to trigger another one. Recent wind loading. Are we seeing those big plumes come off the high peaks or even off these lower elevation ridges? Shooting cracks, they often look like this. And again, they can be quite spooky. Sometimes we can start to see these things even in flatter terrain, where maybe they're not going to shoot out and be as dramatic as this one here. There's obviously some slope angle here to pull it apart. But even on a skid track, if you're walking around, you can start to feel that sort of upside down nature, and you might see these big like half circles come off your skis where you're stepping. That's a good example. And then of course, rapid warming. See it a lot here. Powerful sun. With warming, I think it's also important to note that oftentimes it's the solar radiation more than it is the temperature we're concerned with when we're talking about especially a loose wet hazard. So if it's a really sunny day, light winds, even if it's relatively cold, like near freezing, we might still see that surface warm up pretty substantially. Right on. So I also want to talk about the avalanche danger scale and hazard versus risk. So understanding the avalanche danger scale is an important part of reading and understanding the avalanche forecast. And basically we rate the danger on a 1 to 5 scale. It's color coded. And what's important to remember about the danger scale that I think is often overlooked is it's actually an exponential scale. So as we move up from low to moderate to considerable, we're actually increasing our relative risk at an exponential rate rather than at a linear rate. So with that, when we move from low to moderate hazard, we're all of a sudden going from avalanches being completely unlikely and isolated to kind of random areas in the terrain to more specific distribution. It's going to be a lot harder to avoid the areas where that might be. And they're also getting larger in size, right? And then again, when we move to considerable, high, and extreme. And that's just, I think, important to remember that as we move up in that scale, it's like my margins inherently get smaller when I'm out there. And then this is also important to think about that this is when most fatalities happen, is during considerable hazard. And I think this kind of, this graph here, I think it makes sense to me. Obviously, if it's extreme danger, it's very unlikely that we're going to want to go outside. Oftentimes, this is during really big storm events or particularly dangerous times when we might see avalanches like from one mountain breaking all the way to the next one over, right? So extreme events are pretty rare, but also when it is that high, it's pretty, it's not as attractive to get out. And that's the same with high danger. The difference between high and extreme is sometimes, I think, the hardest for me to conceptualize. because there's still quite large avalanches that are very likely or almost certain at high danger. But we start to see the considerable range. That's when natural avalanche activities is not as likely, right? So we might have to, you might need that human trigger to see the avalanche, right? And I think that is a dangerous time for us as humans to go out there, because we might think it's good to go, or I can manage that, right? But I'm still that trigger, and human triggered avalanches are still likely. So hazard versus risk. And I think this is really important for us to kind of keep in mind, because when we write an avalanche forecast, we are describing a hazard, right? We are describing the likelihood of avalanches occurring, whether it is a human triggered or a natural trigger. And we're describing the size potential within those, right? And where they might be in their terrain. But it's not really a problem if there's no one there to interact with it, right? We as humans are kind of selfish beings. We want to survive and have fun out there skiing. And that's really where we are taking the risk by entering that terrain and interacting with that objective hazard. And I think this is an important thing for us to kind of keep in mind and conceptualize with ourselves, is because I can control and decide how much risk I'm willing to take, or my partners can do the same, right? And then that's how we build good ski partnerships, is by being on the same level of risk tolerance. But we can't really change the hazard. And so I think it's important that we keep that in mind as we interact with the avalanche forecast, because we are describing an objective hazard. We're not describing your risk tolerance, right? And that might be different for different people. And so what does that really mean to me as a skier? And I think for me, it is trying to create bigger margins, trying to understand when I can step it out into more consequential terrain, or when I want to back it off, right? And if I have a higher confidence in the hazard, in being able to manage that hazard and manage that risk, then I can start to kind of go into more consequential, complex terrain. If I have less confidence, then I want to back off, right? And I can set myself up by doing the homework, right? Reading the avalanche forecast throughout the whole season, getting that season history built in your head, understanding the weather and the terrain features, and just really kind of cluing in, and also understanding myself. What is my tolerance for that risk? Is it worth it, right? And then, of course, being able to talk about that is important. Make those decisions. Any questions so far, you guys, before we move on? Okay. Anything from? Nope. Well, let's talk about the season. Well, our season kind of started in October. We saw some early season snowfall, followed by almost a month of high pressure kind of after mid-November. I think we had kind of two rounds of snow there early on. And we had pretty thin coverage, but over that high pressure time, we saw a lot of that coverage kind of dwindle away, especially on more solar aspects. And this was a memorable ski day from early season. Tioga Road was still open. I think we had to walk like 3 or 4 times up and down across big rock swaths. But you can still get out and slide early on. But what we saw during that prolonged kind of dry spell before it snowed again in December was a lot of that early snow did kind of weaken and turn into more of a faceted base for the snowpack. And then, of course, December was pretty memorable this year. These numbers, you guys, are all from the Sesame plot up on Mammoth. But we had 152 inches of snow and almost 23 inches of water in the month of December. And that came, I want to say it was in 2 kind of big waves of snow, but I felt like this was a pretty unique event because it was really prolonged. We had snow almost every day, and it kept the skiing quite good. I feel like often we see these really big events in a short amount of time. And so it's really nice to have kind of a prolonged storm system. It's quite active avalanche cycle. We had several large Persistent-Slab avalanches. It was kind of hard to confirm whether the really large ones we were seeing were Persistent-Slabs all the time, just because it was snowing a lot and it was hard to get up into those areas to check. But there are quite a few that I suspect we still had that old snow coverage from the October and November storms there. We saw a ton of wind slabs, some storm slab activity, particularly on one day. I think it was just before Christmas. We had a storm came in pretty cold and then got pretty warm and wet. We actually had a rain event in the town of Mammoth. And that was a really active storm slab cycle until it cooled down again. And then we did have a couple close calls. We had quite a bit of roof avalanche activity in town in Mammoth, including up on the mountain. I think there's a pretty big one up there. This was a wind slab that occurred kind of down in some lower elevation terrain below tree line. Pretty complex terrain, but this one spooked some folks. This one might even still be able to see that crown up there in San Joaquin. And this was a pretty notable event from Mammoth Mountain. This is in the Paranoids. You can definitely still see this crown. But this is one of those persistent slab avalanches that occurred during a major load event. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, but I think this terrain was open for a couple months before this event occurred. So this is a good example why we always want to keep those weak layers in mind, even if it's been traveled on before. And then, of course, January came around and we saw no measurable precip for the entire month of January, and really until yesterday. December 26th was the last measurable precip until yesterday. And, you know, I actually was really impressed at how well our snowpack held on for the month of January. It remained cold. We did have a couple kind of major wind events, but overall it was pretty light wind and moderate, mild temperatures, and the coverage is really maintained pretty well. We saw some variable and challenging skiing develop. A lot of really hard and slick surfaces on those more northerly, kind of higher elevation alpine aspects, and we saw some sort of pseudo corn develop on some solars, and quite a bit of crusts. And then eventually it started to see those surface facets sort of take hold in more sheltered, shaded terrain, which was quite nice for the knees. But during this, if you guys have been reading the forecast, you're well aware, but we've been talking a lot about the slide for life conditions. And we did have a couple scary, spooky events, close calls, if you will. One here, this is the hourglass. I'm not sure if this boot pack is still in, but the search and rescue actually put this in to help a couple who had done the traverse from Mammoth descend the hourglass. They didn't have any ski crampons or boot crampons or ESACs, and they needed some help getting down through that terrain. So that I'm sure this was quite helpful for everyone who wanted to go up the hourglass also. And it may still be there. I haven't been there since this last storm, but and then probably one of the scarier events, close calls of the year, someone climbed up the looker's right shoulder on Laurel to ski the Pinner Couloir, and they took a fall within the first couple turns, and they actually slid the entirety of the couloir. They survived, which is great, but you can imagine that was a scary and kind of rough ride. And I will say it did snow yesterday, but I would still advise you bring your sharps with you. It did not snow that much, and there was still quite a bit of kind of slick surfaces out there, and now it just has a little bit of dust on top to add some spice to life. So yesterday we received 2.5 inches on the Sesame plot, and up to 6 inches recorded elsewhere in the range. But kind of sporadic coverage out of this most recent storm, definitely that dust on crust feeling in a lot of areas. And really, I think the big thing to keep in mind as we start to see more storms, hopefully, is all those different surfaces that we had, right? We often say that today's surface is tomorrow's weak layer. And I think that's definitely true for us right now. We've got, you can still find some fairly large basal facets out there in the right areas. This is a good example of some really nice surface faceted, we call this facet POW or recycled POW, which has been skiing really well, but this is going to be a real weak surface for snow to interact with. This is some really well-developed surface hoar. These were like 2.5 inches in size, really huge. And there's surface ore ranging in a lot of different size ranges out there in different areas. And it's been cool to watch it actually start to melt during the day and then regrow again, and really well established out there. This is going to be, it's not everywhere, but it's enough places that I wouldn't be surprised if we see some activity on some surface ore once we get a substantial load. And then this is a good example of what some solar aspects are looking like. These sort of penitentes, they're more angled right now because the sun's not as high in the sky. I was describing them as potato chips skiing. But these actually these were the biggest I've seen. This was just a few days ago, but they were probably 18 inches or so. And, I could dig the nose of the ski in and almost have it hit my shin as I was skiing through. So anyways, this is all just to say that it's quite a variety out there when you think of the snow surface. And it's going to be important to keep all of these different things in mind as we start to see more snow, because we have a high potential of some persistent weak layers if we see that substantial load on top. And hopefully we do, because we could use it. Yeah, and so looking forward, we had this brief event yesterday, and in the near future, it looks like we might be in for another similar event beginning of next week. And the forecasters up in Reno are kind of hinting at a broader pattern change, but I think time will tell on that one. Keep your fingers crossed to your snow dance, and yeah, be kind to your knees for now. Any questions, you guys? Okay. Well, thanks for coming out and supporting your local Avalanche Center. We appreciate it.